LuckyShots podcast with your host, Ricky Larson, presented by LuckyShots Media.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back into the LuckyShots podcast. I'm Ricky Larson. With the majesty of the 2021 NFL Draft behind us, it's time to start looking forward to the 2021 fantasy football season. Today, we will look at some of the top draft prospects, their team situation, and how viable they will be for your fantasy team this coming year. Alrighty, let's hop right into the number one overall pick, Trevor Lawrence. Lawrence was drafted number one overall by the Jacksonville Jaguars, who are now under the leadership of none other than Urban Meyer. As a Clemson Tiger, Lawrence had 35 starts, winning 34 of his 36 games. He only missed 2 games in his collegiate career due to COVID-19 last season, but the guy is a proven winner. But is he all hype? I try not to hop onto the hype train right away with the rookies, especially rookie quarterbacks, but it's hard not to believe in Trevor Lawrence. He threw for over 10,000 yards and 90 touchdowns in his career at Clemson, while completing 66% of his passes. Now in Jacksonville, he's coming into a pretty good situation. The fact that he is going to be the starting quarterback in Jacksonville did do its part to make him feel comfortable by drafting his backfield mate Travis Etienne in the first round as well. What Jacksonville didn't do was get a solid offensive line to protect their young franchise quarterback. Jacksonville has a very inexperienced offensive line, with all of their starters having just 16 games or less of starting time. What they did do was they went out and they got some weapons to help him out in free agency. They picked up Marvin Jones from the Lions, which is going to help. Now, do I think you should invest in Trevor Lawrence when it comes to your fantasy draft? Yes. However, he should not be the first option at quarterback that you look at. You should obviously go after Patrick Mahomes, Aaron Rodgers, guys like that. But Lawrence could easily be a second quarterback that you are taking just to build some depth. And, in case of injury or poor play from your top quarterback, he could be a viable option. I'll give Trevor Lawrence a B+ fantasy draft grade for this upcoming season. Sticking on the trend of quarterbacks, next up is number 2 draft pick Zach Wilson. Wilson was drafted number 2 by the New York Jets. As a BYU Cougar, Wilson started in 28 games, but played in 30. He threw for 7,600 yards and 56 touchdowns in his college career. The Jets are also under different leadership, with Adam Gase finally being fired at the end of last season and Robert Saleh taking over. Wilson is coming into a starting situation as well, and the Jets have done their part so far to protect their young gun. They also drafted Elijah Vera Tucker and picked up George Fant in the offseason. Last year, the Jets took offensive lineman Mekhi Becton in the draft as well and have built a decent offensive line for Wilson. They also did pick up Keelan Cole and Corey Davis in the offseason, but both players aren't really proven playmakers, but they definitely have a chance to be. The Jets also drafted Elijah Moore and Michael Carter in the draft, with Moore being the number 7 wide receiver in the draft and Carter being the number 4 running back in the draft according to CBS NFL. Wilson's situation is about as ideal as Lawrence's. However, I don't believe Wilson is as talented as Lawrence. Would I take Zach Wilson in this year's fantasy draft? Probably not. I don't see an upside in Wilson, and my player comparison for him would probably be somewhere in the realm of Baker Mayfield. He has good talent, but it might take a while because of the situation he is in to stick. I'll give Zach Wilson a C+ grade for this year's fantasy draft. And to cap off the quarterback madness this year's draft contained, we take a look at the number 11 pick, Justin Fields. Justin Fields was drafted number 11 by the Chicago Bears, who traded up in the draft to get him. As a Buckeye, he threw for 5,700 yards and 67 touchdowns in his 34 starts. Now, Fields is in a sticky situation. He was the top pick for the team. However, earlier in the offseason, the Bears acquired Andy Dalton, who voiced he chose Chicago because they said he would be their starter. Where does this leave Fields? Well, best case scenario, Fields is in a quarterback competition with Dalton and has a chance to see this field as soon as this season, but fantasy-wise, that makes him a hard bet. The Bears do have solid weapons with David Montgomery, Anthony Miller, and all-pro wide receiver Allen Robinson on the squad. But the idea that Fields may not see the field until later this year, if at all, it makes me kind of steer away from him as a fantasy draft pick. I give Justin Fields a C- fantasy draft grade for this coming season. Okay, I lied. We can also talk about Trey Lance, the quarterback taken number 3 by the San Francisco 49ers. However, the team still has Jimmy Garoppolo, and unless they trade him before the season starts, he is their projected starter, making Trey Lance, as a fantasy quarterback, irrelevant in my eyes. Now let's move the conversation on to running backs and talk about the first running back taken off the board, Najee Harris. Harris was selected 24th overall by the Pittsburgh Steelers and could have you asked for a better spot for Harris to be drafted. Historically, the Steelers like to run the football, and with Big Ben on his last leg, or elbow, you could say, the Steelers will definitely look to the ground game more to keep them moving forward. Plus, with the exit of James Conner from the backfield, Harris will have what it seems like the green light. Harris ran for over 1,000 yards in his last 2 seasons, and last season ran for 26 touchdowns. He's a powerful and quick runner, and combine that with the always tough Steelers offensive line, I foresee the ground game taking off for the Steelers with Najee Harris leading the way. This is also great news for fantasy football. There are a lot of top running backs that will come off the board first, leaving Harris as a possible pickup in the 2nd or 3rd rounds of your draft. I give Najee Harris an A fantasy draft grade. Alrighty, and now let's backtrack a little bit here, as we've already mentioned his name, but let's take a look at the second running back taken, the pick right after Harris, Travis Etienne. The Jags picked him up with the 25th overall pick in the draft. We have already stated the possibility of chemistry with himself and Trevor Lawrence, but let's have a deeper look into Etienne. The man is a touchdown machine. He had double-digit rushing touchdowns all of his 4 years that he played at Clemson, with one of those years being a 24-touchdown season. In his sophomore and junior seasons, he rushed for over 1,600 yards. Last season, with 3 less games than normal, he still racked up nearly 1,000 yards. As well as being a rushing threat, he is a viable option in the passing game, and he can run the ball, bail his quarterback out as a check down, and his athletic ability are something to admire. He does run into a hiccup as a fantasy running back, however, because of James Robinson. Robinson had a huge rookie season last year as an undrafted free agent. With no answers as to who will lead the backfield or if the two will split carries, this could possibly dip into Etienne's fantasy numbers, but his saving grace is his receiving ability, which could stack up fantasy points in PPR leagues. The uncertainty of the backfield I'm going to have to give Travis Etienne a B- fantasy grade for this season. Next up, we're going to move on to wide receivers, and the top wide receiver taken in the draft, Ja'Marr Chase. Chase was selected number 5 overall by the Cincinnati Bengals, which reunites a dangerous LSU tandem of himself and the Bengals' top pick of last year, Joe Burrow. Chase is a threat at wide receiver, even though he opted out of the 2020 season. In Chase's last season of 2019, he had 84 receptions for nearly 1,800 yards and 20 touchdowns en route to a national championship. And who was throwing him the ball? That's right, Joe Burrow. I love this landing spot for Chase, and what makes it better is that the Bengals tripled up on LSU, drafting offensive lineman Jackson Carman to build the offensive line for their franchise quarterback. Not to mention the team chemistry that those three can have. Chase is slated to be in the main receiving core for the Bengals, but the only problem is he could be fighting for touches. Cincinnati already has 2 solid wide receivers, Tyler Boyd, who had 79 receptions last season, and T. Higgins, who had 67 receptions last season as the Bengals' second-round pick last year. However, if the LSU chemistry kicks in, Burrow could be looking Chase's way in pressure situations, which could equal a lot of targets for the rookie. Ja'Marr Chase gets a B+ fantasy draft grade for this upcoming season. Now let's check out the number 6 pick in the draft, Jalen Waddle. Waddle also sat out most of the 2020 season, only playing 6 games, but it didn't seem to affect his draft status that much, as the Miami Dolphins took him as the second receiver off the board. Keeping on track with deadly college combos, Waddle will have a reunion with Tua Tagovailoa. Waddle is a quick, agile slot wide receiver with breakaway speed. Many corners had a hard time covering his speed, as he was able to beat them off the line on most plays. The Dolphins gave their young franchise quarterback another weapon, and this could be a dangerous offense this coming season. Waddle is in the same situation as Chase, however, because he will have to share touches with the Dolphins' top wide receiver, DeVonta Parker, and the newest acquisition of Will Fuller. I have high hopes for Waddle like I do Chase because of the chemistry that he can have with Tagovailoa. Would I take Waddle in the fantasy draft? Yes, but I would wait quite a while on it. You should take at least 3 other solid wide receivers before looking at drafting Waddle. If you can pick him up in the 6th or 7th round, he would be a high value at that point. I give Jalen Waddle a B+ fantasy draft grade for this coming season. Let's move on to the final wide receiver I'd like to talk about, DeVonta Smith. The Heisman winner was taken 10th overall by the Philadelphia Eagles, pairing him with Jalen Hurts, a former Alabama quarterback who played with Smith for a limited amount. In Smith's Heisman campaign last year, he raked in 117 receptions for 1,800 yards and 23 touchdowns. DeVonta is coming into a really good situation, as he is slated to probably be the number 2 wide receiver for the Eagles offense behind Jalen Reagor. But in my opinion, he could easily make himself the number 1 target in the passing game. The only problem here is that Jalen Hurts hasn't really proven himself as a great passer, with most of what we saw from him last season was his athleticism running the football. Hurts only completed 20 or more passes in 2 of his 5 outings last year, so you'll have to take a look at DeVonta Smith with some hesitancy. I think that Smith has the same fantasy draft capital as the aforementioned receivers, but I think his upside is higher due to the fact that he has less competition for touches. You should be able to get a bigger bet on Smith in the fantasy draft because he has a higher chance of targets than other rookie wideouts to start the season. I give the Heisman winner an A- fantasy draft grade. Moving on to our next prospect, who technically isn't a wide receiver, but he is a tight end, and he was selected over every wide receiver and some quarterbacks in the draft, Kyle Pitts. Pitts is formerly a Florida Gator, but was selected number 4 overall by the Atlanta Falcons. He is a matchup nightmare. At 6'6", nearly 250 pounds, he can line up as a traditional tight end, split out into the slot, or even line up as a wide receiver. He has a combination of size, speed, and length that make him hard to handle. Too big for a corner to cover, too fast for a linebacker to keep up with, the Falcons scored a huge target here. Pitts will be the top tight end for the Falcons, but runs into a small problem of finding targets. The team still has Calvin Ridley, but Pitts could find those valuable red zone targets because of his size, making him highly favorable for your fantasy rosters. And with Julio Jones out of the picture, the target situation starting to look a lot better. And with the tight end landscape for the fantasy football being Travis Kelce, Darren Waller, or George Kittle, Kyle Pitts already finds himself a spot on your fantasy rosters at a weak position. I give Kyle Pitts an A- fantasy draft grade. Now let's take a quick look at a few more draft picks that have the possibility of being fantasy relevant at some point this coming season. Mac Jones was drafted 15th overall by the New England Patriots. With the performance of Cam Newton last season, it seems that he could be on a short leash this year, leaving the door open for Jones to possibly take over as the starter. He isn't a first choice for your fantasy team, but there's a chance he could become relevant sooner rather than later. I give Mac Jones a D+ fantasy grade that could bump up to probably a C if he ends up starting this year. Rashad Bateman was drafted 27th overall by the Baltimore Ravens. Bateman is slated to be one of the top 3 wide receivers for the Ravens, but let's be honest, there isn't much about the Ravens' passing game that is lucrative for fantasy managers. Bateman is a good talent with a good opportunity, but until Baltimore's passing game proves to be fruitful, it will be hard to invest in Bateman. I'm going to go ahead and give him a C- fantasy draft grade. Elijah Moore was drafted 34th overall by the New York Jets. Moore isn't the top of the wide receiver ranks for the Jets, but the Jets' receiving core isn't the strongest. Moore has a chance to work himself into targets for the offense, and the Jets may find themselves in familiar situations of playing from behind, which will end up putting the output of the passing game higher. I give Elijah Moore a D+ fantasy draft grade. Javonte Williams was drafted 35th overall by the Denver Broncos. The history of Denver's backfield has been split for quite a few years now, which means Williams will see carries this upcoming season. One thing the Broncos did well last year, despite the injuries in its backfield, was run the football. This bodes well for Williams. With his skill set, he could be a viable option for your fantasy squad, especially if you handcuff him to Melvin Gordon, who missed time due to injury and other things last year. I give JAVONTE a C+ fantasy grade. Alright, well that is all for today, folks. These were your 2021 Draft Class Fantasy Rankings. Tune in next time as we dive into the top options for your fantasy squad at each position. Thanks for watching the Lucky Shots podcast. I'm Ricky Larson. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Lucky Shots podcast. Join us next week.